Pleased with my colleague Dan Ziblatt to welcome you back to our year-long series on questions of fascism and democracy. Unfortunately, far too relevant a topic in today's world. I just want to alert you to the poster, and you'll find various paper copies of it upstairs as well. It's also on the Center for European Studies website. And the poster is good because it alerts you to all the upcoming talks, as well as reminding you of some of the past wonderful talks. And of the upcoming talks, before I introduce today's speaker, I'll just mention that next week you'll see there's a talk by Katie Ebner-Landy, who's a junior fellow now at Harvard Society of Fellows, who'll be speaking on late fascist aesthetics, a theory of the online forum. And I've had a foretaste of at least a version of some of her arguments. It's a theoretically very bracing, interesting inquiry into the nature of social media today and what role social media plays in right-wing radicalization and democratic decay. So I think that should be a very, very interesting topic. But of course, you haven't come for that topic. So I'll turn back to today's topic. And I'm very pleased to welcome today's speaker, who is Lenka Bustikova, who is a director of the Center for European Studies and professor of political science at the University of Florida. Now, she grew up in Prague, and her research focuses on illiberalism, polarization, and democratic erosion. She's part of the East European Politics Group in the Department of Political Science at the University of Florida. Her book, Extreme Reactions, Radical Right Mobilization in Eastern Europe, was published by Cambridge University Press. And I should note that it received Harvard University's own Davis Center Book Prize in Political and Social Studies. I can promise you it's not sheer nepotism that led us to invite her back here. She's also a recipient of the Best Article Prize from the European Politics and Society section and Best Paper Prize from the Comparative Democratization section of the APSA, American Political Science Association. So she's quite an accomplished scholar, and her list of articles is so long that if I read it all out to you, we will have moved on towards 6 o'clock. She's currently editor of the journal East European Politics. She's also an editor of Cambridge Elements on Politics and Society from Central Europe to Central Asia, and the Routledge Studies on Political Parties and Party Systems. She serves as head of the advisory board for the Czech National Institute for the Study of Socioeconomic Impacts and Risks, and she will be speaking to us today on uncivil society and polarization in Eastern Europe. Please welcome Professor Bustikova.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. I would like to thank Professor Gordon, Professor Ziblatt for this invitation. I would also like to add that as of year, I'm a very accomplished administrator, so I will make sure to put it on my bio next time. And actually, speaking of my administrative experience, I'm so thrilled to be here because I can still talk about the subject, and it makes me incredibly happy and elated. So today I'm going to talk about an ongoing research. Some of the work has been done, some of it, a lot of the work that you will see, especially in the second half of the talk, is a work in progress. And it's about uncivil society and polarization in Eastern Europe or Central Europe or former Visegrad 4 countries. One of the things that has been puzzling me recently is changes in regulatory frameworks when it comes to reproduction, gender rights, sort of rise of polarization of issues that relate to LGBTQ rights. So all this interest is behind sort of this new research agenda that shifted from ethnicity to the study of contestation of sexual rights and women's rights. So why study socially conservative groups? In my previous work, I have done a lot of work on far-right parties, and typically when we think about Arguments about populism, far right, and backsliding, you can put them into two baskets. Either you focus on the demand side, which, as many of you know, suggests that if people demand certain policies, let's say restriction of gay and lesbian rights, or restriction of right to abortion, then the politicians will follow and deliver these policies. On the other hand, there is a supply side that blames or that attributes changes in policies, in political orientations, to elites, and it is sort of the elites have the ability to frame the debate and push forward agendas regardless of public support. There have been a lot of talking always about way to bridge the demand and supply side explanations, and a go-to space to really mediate between these two explanations is to look at intermediary organizations or ancillary groups, and these are greatly missing from a lot of the conversations, at least in political science. So recently there is some new work by Andrea Pirro and a lot of his co-authors that looks about far-right movements and movement parties and ways in which some of these issues are mediated via mobilization from below of far-right networks and parties. But and so there's also another line of research, of course, that focuses on churches as global players and the role that religiosity plays. And one thing that these things are missing, and I think one of the reasons why this research is missing a look at not at churches, not at far-right networks of hooligans, but to look at organizations that are NGOs or advocacy groups or church ancillary groups. So these are organizations that are not churches. These are sitting somewhere in the middle space. They are quite new in many of these instances. And until very recently, nobody realized that they're amassing more and more political power. And I will show you some examples of that. So bad civic activism is channeled via these intermediary groups, but this is not a situation where you take over a bad actor. It's a situation where the intermediary organizations forge and shape some of, let's say, parental group associations or church-related networks and weaponize them and form sort of new organizations that are then used for activism. So what is uncivil society? It is one of those concepts that's very hard to define. Michael Bernhardt thinks of it as a realm of anti-system elements pursuing illiberal agendas that lack commitment to liberal democracy. However, if you look at the original concept from Kopecky and Mude, they actually think of uncivil society as a subset of civil society. So they say the uncivil society is a part of civil society that has semi-authoritarian actors that are not loyal to democracy. However, for example, a foundation work that actually we published in our journal by Bela Gryskowicz about the rise of Fidesz and their ability to win elections in 2010 speaks about Fidesz taking over civic circles, conservative networks affiliated with churches. And when you sort of look at the mechanisms of mobilization and the way some of these groups, amass power, you see that they pursue quite legitimate ideological objectives, at least initially, and they use institutional channels of party competition. So these are not all. These are not always militant. These are very often these groups actually are weaponizing and using the games of the rule, the game that has been set for them, and they use it very. They use it very efficiently. So the civil society, I think of it as an umbrella group that includes violent groups such as Azov in Ukraine, but also socially conservative movements and ancillary organizations that seek to undermine liberal democracy, especially minority protection, and especially in this domain, it is a minority protection of sexual minorities and some advances that have been achieved by women. It is actually remarkable how little of this mobilization goes hand in hand with ethnic contestation. So it seems as if in sort of the big picture of things that the ethnic contestation in Eastern Europe has been, is quite weak actually, especially if you compare it to 1990s. But a lot of the contestation is really done in the domain of LGBTQ rights and women's rights, not so much around ethnicity. Another way to think about it is to think about it as a reaction to liberalism. Marlene Rauer thinks about illiberalism as a backlash against living liberalism, and thinks about Elizabeth something that's thin and vacuous. So I think a way to think about this phenomenon, a backlash against liberalism, but against an experience that a lot of these societies have from 1989 onwards with liberalism, both in its economic and societal form. And we see in some cases an effort or an emergence of confessional illiberalism, which is a fusion of state, family, and intermediary confessional organizations. And sort of the one important element of backlash here is that this is a lot of the policies and a lot of the backlash against 1990s is also a backlash against aspirational civil society of the good old progressive civil society of the 1990s. So, but this is done in a new way. It is done in a way where the civil society or uncivil society associations are fusing power with state. This is not what the progressive groups did in the 1990s. It is very transnational, so that is also a new phenomena. When you see this, these groups are very well organized. A lot of the scripts that are used, for example, to change constitutional amendments or put forward policy recommendations are from the same playbook, and they are very transactional. So these organizations, the difference between the 1990s and now is that in 1990s, the progressive civil society groups, they wanted money from the state, they got it, but didn't seek to form alliances. They wanted to hold the state and political parties accountable, and they always thought that they should be sort of parallel to parties. This sort of the conservative civil groups view this relationship very differently. A lot of it is, a lot of the uncivil or sort of right-wing advocacy groups provide great social service provision that gives them great legitimacy, sometimes cover, but it has to be acknowledged that the services that they provide are quite meaningful. In 2007, the Polish government created sort of the Launch Justice Polish government created a vehicle to favor civil society organizations. They created a National Institute of Freedom for Development of Civil Society, replaced the previous fund, also replaced the way civil societies are funded. And Piotr Gliński, the Minister of Culture, was very open, and he said, our goal is to provide all Polish civil society organizations with an equal access to public funds. So there was an idea that the 1990s were a time when the public funds were channeled to what we would call progressive agendas, and it's time to level the playing field. On the other side, you can see this is Forum Života, which is an advocacy group in Slovakia that I'm going to talk about a little bit, that does a lot of work with pregnant women, provides help and assistance. And if you sort of look at their public statements or conversations, it's about we are just an NGO that's trying to help women. Please help us more money, even though we all know that we have certain political connections and advocacies in the parliament. So socially conservative groups are incredibly important. I'm convinced that you cannot understand changes in the regulatory framework unless you understand that these are new groups that came from shadows sometimes, and they really, behind closed doors, advocate for some of these changes, even in countries like the Czech Republic, where you wouldn't expect it. So, for example, Czech Republic is one of the most secular countries in Europe with abortion on demand. Abortion is actually easier in the Czech Republic than in Germany. In 2017, a new organization was formed. It was a non-profit organization. It was a parent volunteer work that served for parents and had no money. And this organization, which is called Alliance for Family, by 2021 is an organization that works closely with some elements from Christian Democratic Party, works with politicians, and drafts legal briefs for the Constitutional Court deciding on legality of foreign adoptions of same-sex couples, and provides also some legal and advice, and actually drafts some bills that sometimes don't succeed. But you have an organization that from 2017 comes from obscurity to having enormous power behind the doors. And when I interviewed some of the Czech journalists in the Czech Republic that deal with these issues, you hear over and over, we had no idea that these guys exist. A parent sister organization in Slovakia, Alliance for Family, was founded in 2013. Today, it's a network of more than 90 organizations in non-profit sector of social care, and it bursted in the Slovak scene in 2014 when it collected over 100,000 signatures for referendum on family. So in 2014, Slovakia had a referendum in which they were trying to amend the constitution to have an amendment that would declare marriage as a marriage between man and woman. This referendum failed. It failed because of the lower turnout, but Alliance for Family became a very important actor in Slovak political life after this mobilization below. That failed, but nevertheless they changed the scene in Slovakia. Another example is very recent, is a transnational impact, or impact that is spilling over. And I'll talk about a little bit briefly, draws on some of my work with Petra. And it's a story how Polish Ordo Juris killed ratification of the Istanbul Convention in the Czech Senate. So the Czech Senate is controlled by pro-democratic right-wing parties. They promised that they will, improve the lives of gays and women, that they would ratify the Istanbul Convention. And, the public opinion really doesn't care about the Istanbul Convention. It's a relatively, liberal, so the constituency of the right-wing coalition is liberal and progressive, yet this bill failed in the Senate. It was not rejected, it failed to reach the quorum. And so what happened? And then when you start digging, you realize that there was a very small fraction of Czech senators that were subjected to a targeted campaign that originated from Ordo Juris, which is an organization in Poland. And that sort of targeted campaign empowered a small but vocal social conservative faction in the ruling coalition that eventually killed the bill, which again was supposed to go through. The official position of the Czech government was that the Istanbul Convention should be ratified. And the Czech Republic is one of the countries that signed it, but they haven't ratified it. Ordo Juris, I will talk about this organization later, is a very powerful legal advocacy group in Poland. It's an institute for legal culture founded in 2013. And in their own words, it gathers academics and legal practitioners with the aim of promoting a legal culture based on respect for human dignity and rights. They hate the Istanbul Convention. They tried to kill it in Poland. It's not possible. They tried to meddle in other countries, but in the Czech case, they were successful. So the way the bill was killed is that for the vote to pass, you need a quorum of 36. The quorum was 34. And so the way this was killed was by abstention. So there are two ways to abstain, but in a way, because some people didn't show up and some abstained, the quorum was not reached. If you think who abstained, these are the parties of the governing coalition. One of them is a Christian Democratic Party, and these people were sort of subjected to this campaigning and abstained. And so one thing that happened is that Ordo was sort of campaigning and advocating, launched a email campaign, and Petra, who is my co-author, she managed to get emails from one of the female senators that she received during this campaign, and then we compared some of the emails to the debate on the floor. And so there were a lot of arguments put forward why the Istanbul Convention should not pass. The Istanbul Convention is a convention that should enhance protections against domestic violence and abuse. And so one of the strong arguments, and that's going to come out later in the analysis, is an argument that it is the Istanbul Convention undermines traditional family that consists of mother, father, and their children. So this is in an email. It's a nasty email that was written to her. This is then also in the debate, and sort of one of the arguments used in the debate was that yes, if you beat your wife and mother of your children, is not a nice thing to do. However, does it really make sense to prosecute the perpetrator? Because if you remove the father or the partner from the family, you deprive the family unit, of the father figure. And it's better to preserve the family unit than to prosecute and punish the perpetrator, even though that's in line of the Czech law. So this was one of the sort of strong arguments that came through in the debate, and it's sort of part of the talking points of Ordo Iuris, and this was a perfect synergy. So this is, as far as we know, the first instance of Ordo Iuris successful shaping policy and law abroad. Of course, it failed because the domestic, the politicians, they voted, they abstained, and they killed it. However, the activism and sort of the targeted, very intense campaign tipped the scales in this case. So I just want to, hopefully, I'm convincing you that these socially conservative groups really matter, because when you think, and I'm not going to go into depth here, when you want to understand why a lot of regulatory issues are changing in Eastern Europe, especially regulations over adoptions of children by gay couples, regulations about child bringing, regulation of parental groups, you will very often see that a lot of these changes are not compatible with public opinion support. So, for example, in all of these 4 countries, most people support abortion rights. But you have, in Poland, basically, Poland is a country with a total abortion ban. Hungary doesn't have an abortion ban, but has put forward procedures that make access to abortion much more difficult. And so very often the changes that you see being proposed as amendments in Parliament can be tracked to advocacy of socially conservative groups, sort of proposing it, writing it, and advocating for it. One thing that, if you look at sort of comparatively at these cases, I would like to highlight one thing that, very often Eastern Europe is viewed as a region with traditional values and sort of very restrictive policies, but actually there is a great degree of variation. So the Czech Republic has full access to abortion, and Czech Republic and Hungary had registered partnerships since 2009 or 2006. So in a way, in early 2000s, there were a lot of progressive policies actually being put forward, and they were quite successful. The least restrictive regulatory framework is in Slovakia and Czech Republic. Slovakia is a very religious country, very conservative country. So you would expect the regulatory framework to be the toughest one. However, it's not. And I think one of the reasons for that is that in both Slovakia and Czech Republic, moderate Christian democratic parties mediate some of these conflicts over regulatory frameworks and don't allow sort of the worst excesses to go through. And this is until very recently, that's changing quite a bit. And in both of these cases, the Christian democratic parties were in governing coalitions that were pro-Western. So they serve with the pro-Western liberals, again, until recently. And I think that's a mechanism through which some of the regulations don't go to the excess they go in Hungary and Poland. So now I would like to sort of look at some systematic study of public support for socially conservative groups in these 4 countries. And this was done through original surveys around 2022 in Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia. And in each of the country, one group was selected, Ordo Iuris in Poland, Center for Fundamental Rights in Hungary, Forum for Life in Slovakia, and Movement for Life in the Czech Republic. It's a study of an indirect support because it uses endorsement experiments, which is a way to associate a group with a policy and then find out what's the level of latent support for the group. So I'm just going to preview very quickly some of the findings from the 4 surveys. So number one, and this is consistent, if you study Poland, you would know this, nobody likes church in politics. None of these countries, there is an appetite for church meddling in politics. However, you will see there are a lot of inconsistent views about the role of Christianity in public education and elsewhere. In a very simplistic way, I'm more and more convinced that a lot of the contestation of these regulatory frameworks and rights is about children, not about women, gay and lesbians, and gender rights. Of course, it's part of the picture, but I think the main focus is about children living in an institution of, a sort of child rearing. The surveys that I will show you, when you do endorsement experiments, you do it because you want to find a support for a group. So this is the third time I have done an endorsement surveys in 3 different research projects where you actually find more of an evidence of people disliking the group and sort of evidence of irritation with the group. So the surveys will show that when you look at indirect, because this is indirect support, that the support for the advocacy groups is really not particularly strong. It also shows that there is a limited ability of these groups to trigger support, and more likely it's going to trigger irritation or backlash. But there is an element that the surveys show that there is a polarizing effect these groups can pull off. So even if, let's say, however, I just want to remind everybody that even though these groups, based on these surveys, have sort of limited ability to mobilize, they, via sort of institutional backdoors and by forging demand, they are very powerful, and probably their power is going to increase over the next 10, 20 years. So I'm going to show you some results from these surveys, and when you do surveys, you want to know what people think. And I think especially with this survey, I sometimes really, really wonder what people think, because you find a lot of inconsistencies. So on the one hand, when we asked in these 4 countries whether church should play a bigger role in politics, in Poland, which has gone through horrible contestation of abortion rights, people say absolutely over my dead body. So absolutely not. Czech Republic, again, highly secular, a lot of divisions between Catholics and Protestants, also quite enthusiastic about it. But when you look in Poland and Hungary, maybe a bit of a quarter of a population thinks that they should play a bigger role in politics. So not particularly enthusiastic about it. However, if you ask whether there should be more support for teaching Christianity in secondary schools, you see that the support is much higher. Again, Poland stands out. I think it's partly part of a huge backlash against Catholic Church and a lot of these policies of meddling that have been there for a long time. So Poland, very unsupportive. Czech Republic is second, and then you have sort of the Polish and Hungarian cases. But even in the Czech case, I was shocked when I saw how much support there is to teach Christianity in secondary schools. And Hungary and Slovakia are quite supportive. As I mentioned before, one thing before I sort of jump into the analysis of some of the policies, if you think that the reason why a lot of these countries are moving towards restricting abortion or making abortion very difficult, if it has anything to do with public support, the answer is absolutely not. In all these countries, the public does not support strict abortion, sort of a very tough abortion ban, including Poland, of course, but even in Hungary and Slovakia, you see that a lot of these policies are not done on demand. So now we go to the what are people thinking? What on earth are people thinking, and how can you square off some of these attitudes? So when you ask people if they support same-sex rights, you see that most people are actually very, very supportive. So if you ask a blank question, children are not involved. Do you support the same rights for same-sex couples? in most countries will say, yeah, of course. And the support is, which are sort of the darker parts of the pie chart, is quite large. However, if you ask people whether marriage should be only between man and woman, in most of these countries, people say, yeah, of course. So this is, in a way, it doesn't square off. And I think one of the reasons, and I didn't have this in the surveys, but I know it from other surveys, is that the support for same-sex marriage really varies whether you bring children into the conversation. The moment you ask people whether it's okay for gay and lesbian couples to adopt children, the support significantly drops. So as long as they don't want anything, just some basic rights that nobody wants to talk about in great detail, it's fine. But fundamentally, these populations believe that the traditional marriage is the preferred way of life. And then I'm going to show you some three more variables that, when we look at the surveys, are going to come up. So this is in the surveys, there are going to be, a bunch of predictors thinking maybe support for these groups are driven by income or economic hardships, or views about some foreigners and nationalities and political allegiances. And most of it really is not particularly strong. There is one killer variable that predicts support for the socially conservative groups, the four that I mentioned, which is a question whether a child needs a home with both mother and father to grow up happily. It's the strongest predictor in 3 countries and the second strongest predictor in Slovakia. So this is an attitudinal question, and there's a strong belief that this is, again, a preferred form of regardless of reality, regardless that we know today a lot of children actually don't live in these types of arrangements. And then there will be 2 other variables that will be, that will play a bit of role in these countries, which is a question whether men make better political leaders than women. So that's going to be a strong predictor, even though we say then most people in Poland and Czech Republic don't believe that's the case. In Poland and Hungary, half or more than half of the population, they do think that men are better leaders than women, and whether when jobs are scarce, men should have more rights to a job than a woman. Again, most disagree, but there is a lot of support for this, again, in Hungary and Slovakia. So let me now sort of proceed to discussion of the survey experiments that ask who endorses groups, and the survey endorsements were done on 4 groups: Movement for Life, Forum for Life, and then in Hungary, Center for Fundamental Rights, and Ordo Iuris in Poland. And I want to say, this is comparative politics, so things are sometimes not comparable, but they are. So there is a big difference between the Polish and Hungarian case and the Czech and Slovak case. The Center for Fundamental Rights and Ordo Iuris are robust legal advocacy machines with enormous amount of power. The survey was done when Law and Justice was still in power. They had ministers, they have people in public administration. The Center for Fundamental Rights, it's basically an arm of a state, organized CPAC. Ordo Iuris, has been founded in 2013. Very, very powerful, and as I demonstrated, they can even now change policies in countries next door. But ideologically, they are aligned. I mean, it's sort of their end game is the same when we bring in the 2 organizations that I thought were closest to the concept in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which is Forum for Life and Movement for Life, which are NGOs that offer help to women who are pregnant, either giving them money or helping them to carry the child to the full term, maybe sometimes helping to find parents, and sort of, their motto is to save lives. So they target pregnant women and try to convince them to keep the baby, not to have an abortion. But as you know from sort of the previous part of the presentation, they also are working behind the roads, already writing legal briefs, sort of similar to what Ordo Iuris is doing, and mobilizing from below, for example, for referenda and other things. but they're much weaker. And in these cases, you do not see, and especially with Forum Života, there is some indication, but you don't see sort of this fusion with the state that was the case in Poland, and that is currently the case in Hungary. So the way the endorsement experiment works, it's a survey experiment. When you have a representative sample that you randomly divide in two parts, you have a control group and you read a set of policies to the control group. So the set of policies that were used was marriage between man and woman, strict abortion, absolute abortion ban, and whether people think that people should learn about the basics of Christian culture in school. And then you have a treated group in which you have, in which you are endorsing an organization. And sort of the difference in support between the groups gives you a sort of sense of how much the organization is endorsed. And sort of the endorsement also has to be selected, that these policies have to be associated with the organization. They cannot be exclusive to the organization. And there is there's a body of literature that says that people, if they endorse these groups associated with these policies, that's a measure of indirect support for these groups. So that's why I'm interpreting it as a support, indirect support for groups. So to think about sort of the goal here is to see whether these groups, so Ordo Iuris, Center for Fundamental Rights, Forum for Life, and Movement for Life, whether there is any evidence of increased support in this experimental group or not. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you do the endorsement experiments to study support, but you very often end up studying backlash or irritation. So these are average treatment effects where you when you compare the experimental and control group. And you can see in the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia, the sign is negative. So that means that if you mention the group, the public actually decreases the support for the group. So in a way, they are irritated or dislike it. In the Polish case, the sign is positive. So mentioning the group increases the support for the group. So that's sort of on the average. You can also see that there are differences between the groups. So there are three policies: marriage, abortion, and Christianity in schools. When you look at the yellow signs, you see that when it comes to abortion, actually the effect works in the positive way. So in the Czech, Polish, and Slovak cases, if the organization is associated with abortion, the support will increase. So it's an increase in support. And two sort of other things I want to mention is that the strongest backlash that we see among these four countries is actually in Hungary, and then I'm going to show why I think it might be the case. So that's where the backlash effect is strongest. It's strong in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but not particularly strong. And I think that's because some of these issues are not as heavily contested in these countries as in Hungary and Poland. And in Poland, you sort of see an increase in support. Again, the survey was done when the Law and Justice was in party, and sort of speaks also to the issue of contestation. The strongest effect of all is the effect in Slovakia on marriage. And again, it sort of reflects the fact that these advocacy groups were instrumental in mobilizing mass protestations for referenda for, marriage between men and women. So I think, and actually the surveys will also show there is a strong mobilization effect to the support. So another way to show this is visually. So, these are the treatment effects when the red is a backlash, and the turco, I guess, is a support. So this is Czech Republic. This is Hungary with the strongest backlash effect. Everything goes in the other direction. Poland is a case where there's actually support, especially the key question is a Christianity in school. And in Slovakia, the effect is quite mixed. So, why do we see this, or how to sort of think about some of these effects? So the strongest effects are in Poland and Hungary, where there's a strong contestation. And the sort of strongest evidence of contestation, the strongest effects are around the area of abortion, not so much the other issues. And I think, and I will speak about this a bit later, is that I think the backlash effect in Hungary is associated with the fact that the Center for Fundamental Rights is viewed as a state agency. So in a way, it is a backlash against the state or state-sponsored organization. And in Poland, what we see is a polarized contestation in which, there's a lot of contestation, both those who fully support these very conservative policies and who oppose them, because a lot of people do, of course, support tough regulations and traditional families. So another way to think about some of these effects, to think, well, there is a story that says, well, it's all about gender. It's women support this and men support that. When you start digging deeper, you realize that the gender variable is actually quite complicated, and in a way, you cannot make any conclusions about men being more like this and women being more like that. So if you look at sort of these charts, what you see is that on the top, you see the distribution of responses. In the Czech Republic, that's Movement for Life and then the control. If you see dark blue, that means that people disagree with it. So the more dark blue you see, the more disagreement you see. So, and you sort of also should look at it as in pairs. So, okay, this is exactly. So this is a pair, this is the experiment and control, and this is divided by genders. So one thing that you can see here is that men support traditional marriage more than women because there is more lighter color here. That's one thing. And here, for example, here you can look at the changes between, the dark blue and the light blue between women. And this is evidence of a backlash effect when women sort of think about the endorsement, they will decrease their support for the movement of life because the dark blue increases. Similarly, Hungary, this is just, you see that actually there is a very strong support for traditional marriage because a lot of these colors are quite light. Abortion ban is not popular, Christianity, so. But here, this is experimental and control group for men. And you see that in Hungary, actually the strongest backlash against the Center for Fundamental Rights is against men, not so much among women. So it's not the case that women are more triggered by this. Men can be supportive or oppose it as well. In Poland, in Ordo Juris, for example, here, this is women supporting or withdrawing their support from Ordo Juris. And this is an effect. So as I mentioned before, Poland is a case where the experimental condition increases support. So women, when it comes to Christianity in schools, when you look at women, they increase their support for Ordo Juris. So in a way, women are supportive of having more Christianity in schools. They are more supportive of Ordo Juris as a representative of this policy. So in a way, this is a strong support from conservative women. And similarly, in Slovakia, you see this is, again, women. So you see that the dark increased because the dark means opposition to the policy. So the blue is a little bit higher in the experimental condition. So this is an evidence of women backlash. But if you go through these back and forth, you will see that there are not that many changes. You see that the backlash against genders varies by policies and that it sometimes it's men, sometimes it's women. There is not a clear-cut story. So then there is a little bit of a political story too, that in the multivariate models will be completely wiped out, but sort of, but I think it's still there. So this is not by gender, this is Hungary, this is voters for Fidesz, and this is voters for all other parties. So immediately what you can see here is that people who did not vote for Fidesz oppose some of these policies much more because the dark blue is much bigger than here, which is the voters for Fidesz. But you can also see in terms of traditional marriage, there's a very strong backlash effect against the Center for Fundamental Rights when you ask about traditional marriage. And so here also you can see that the opposition, the people who did not vote for Fidesz, of course includes Jobbik, that they oppose these policies much more. But the experimental effect very often is not particularly strong, with sort of the exception of the traditional marriage. So these things polarize voters, but there is also an evidence that among the opposition, this can trigger backlash. And finally, in Poland, Ordo Iuris, this is voters for the Law and Justice Party and Konfederacja. So they are deep, deep blue because they love these policies. So again, the darker, the more, in favor you are. So you can see that this is Law and Justice Party and Konfederacja, far right. This is everybody else. Let's not go there. But let's say the voters for the coalition. And so again, you see that, as you would expect, that the voters for the Law and Justice Party are much more supportive about this, and that, especially in this case, you see there is some effect, so political effect when it comes to the endorsement. And so finally, I'm going to show you sort of 4 more graphs that are from multivariate models that try to think about what is it that drives support or opposition to these movements. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not going to be income, it's not going to be sometimes maybe, it's not going to be hardship, it's not going to be even capital cities, it's not going to be a lot of things. Few things will stand out systematically in these countries, and then these countries, of course, are different, so there'll be things that will be specific to it. So the number one variable that predicts support for these movements is a view that the child can be only happy if it lives with a home with mom and dad. And then there are things that you would expect. So people who don't want to have gay partners in their families, who oppose it, support it more, religious people. And then people who think that men are better political leaders in the Czech Republic. So in a way, attitudinal questions, nothing else really stands out. In Hungary, the church and politics, law and order, opposition to gays, so, the usual suspects and religiosity, you will see this, most of this in all the other countries. Number one predictor, child needs both parents. And then there is this variable, which is a dissatisfaction with government. So again, when the survey was done, of course, Fidesz was in power. So it's, again, I think because people associate these groups with sort of being an arm of the government, if you are dissatisfied with the government, you will decrease your support for these groups. So there is a political element to dissatisfaction that I think speaks to the opposition to the fusion of state and Center for Fundamental Rights. The same effect you can see in Poland. So again, on top, of course, the only way child can be happy is mom and dad are there. Religiosity, opposition to gay partnerships, dissatisfaction with the European Union. Actually, this is the only country where it matters. And then this is not a dissatisfaction with the government, this is a dissatisfaction with democracy. So a slightly different variable, but also tapping into a political system variables. And again, in a country where this is hotly contested and when Ordo Iuris was strongly aligned with the government. And finally, Slovakia, one thing is that, the religiosity is a bit stronger than child needs home with mom and dad. But there is one thing, we ask questions whether people demonstrated in support for traditional values and then some other mobilization variables. The only case where this is, the effect is really strong is in Slovakia, which is also the only case where a lot of these advocacy groups actually were at the beginning and organized boots on the ground in favor for these policies that eventually went through the parliament differently, but managed to get there. So to conclude, there is a lot of demand for traditional values in Central Europe and these countries, but it is polarized. A lot of the changes that we will see and that we are seeing are not done by priests. I mean, they do play some role, but this is a battle of lawyers and advocacy groups and regulatory frameworks. Social conservative groups emerge as the sort of the most important vehicle of changes in these frameworks. They live somewhere in between. Very often they're invisible in the shadows, but they have so much inflicted a sort of a great deal of pain. The survey evidence shows that if you look at the public support for them, they have very limited support. And when people are confronted with them, generally they feel resistant, or they don't like them, or there is a backlash element, especially if they are viewed as being in cahoots with the state. So in some way, there are seeds of destruction there also present, in the sense that, you know, if you are viewed as, you know, tainted or contaminated by your collaboration with the state, it can also bring you down because they are not viewed as independent groups. At the same time, these groups very actively forge for a demand from the below. So, for example, this is a post from a Bulgarian parental work that talks about the rights of parents and fighting sort of some progressive national strategy for child imported from Norway. And sort of these groups go after parental advocacy groups and church groups and, you know, frame the agenda and try to weaponize them for purposes. At the end game, again, is the change of the regulatory framework. And again, as let me sort of reiterate that the reason why these groups are incredibly powerful and incredibly successful in a very short period of time is that they are comfortable with political power. They don't demand accountability other than, you know, get our stuff done, which is a big difference with progressive groups that were, you know, playing that they played more clean, but you cannot, I don't think you can win this fight when you play clean, really. And so just to, you know, this is a concluding slide, why. So I think this is, you know, when you think about it, you have to think about it as a broader backlash against liberalism, including sort of the activism and so civic activism of the 1990s that was supported by the European Union and by the states. There is an emergence of extremely powerful and well-organized transnational networks that very often help with these policy briefs and help with drafting regulations and feed it to the politicians. One has to keep in mind that when you step back and think about the backlash of illiberalism, traditional family has a lot of offer if it works. So it's built on bonds of solidarity that are lacking, and especially in the current era, you know, it's very difficult to find, you know, groups that will infuse you with enthusiasm and purpose in life. It's a very effective protection against hardship. When you get sick, when you go to the hospital, when you have a kid, when you need to repair your car, these networks are there, and they are, especially in poor parts, being activated to help you out. They're emotional support network with loyalty, stability, and they have a thick purpose, and very few things out there these days are stable and, you know, infused really with meaning. I also want to point out that based on these surveys, there is a lot of goodwill in the population, in the sense that I think a lot of people are willing to expand rights to gay and lesbians and think about whether gay and lesbians should be able to adopt children and sort of, you know, open the field for them. But at this moment, I think the prevailing view is that these rights should not be done at the expense of breaking commitments associated with traditional family. I think the only way to solve this problem, if someone would be interested in policy recommendations, is to deploy moderate, compassionate conservatism that can diffuse extremism. So these debates are debates about policy issues and not issues that are used to polarize and sort of weaponize against political opponents. And if possible, another way to solve this is to make political parties resilient, more resilient to advocacy groups, but good luck with that. So thank you very much.
so much. This was absolutely fascinating. I know there are lots of questions, and I'm just going to field questions for you so that you don't have to keep a list in your mind of who has their hand raised. But please.
Thank you a lot for your talk. I have a brief comment on the Polish case. You described Ordo Iuris as allies of law and justice. I think the current situation is much more complex. So they were allies in 2016, 2017, but after 2 or 3 years of the first term, their secretaries of state lost their post because they were pushing for abortion ban. And the general public in Poland does not support the current regulation, but Law and Justice did not change the legislation. So the limitation in the access to abortion in Poland was caused by the Constitutional Court. And of course, Law and Justice appointed new judges, but similar ruling took place 20 years ago. So and it is also important that general public does not support the abortion ban, but I think at least half of Law and Justice voters support it. So this issue is fatal for the Polish right. And I don't know what is the public image of similar organization in 3 remaining countries, but in Poland the image of Ordo Iuris is really bad. So they were accused of taking money from Russia, so they won the court case, but still, and one of vice chairmans had an affair with the wife of the second vice chairman. So if there is an affair in the leadership of conservative think tank, people are just joking about them, so they are effective. So maybe the effects in Poland are impacted by this public image. So that's a short comment.
Should I answer briefly? Or
Please.
should I So thank you for it. This is a great question, because what you see with these advocacy groups, sometimes the parties are trapped with them. You see country by country, sometimes the policies that happen to be adopted are actually not what the parties want, but they get in bed with themselves, with a group that is sort of extracting more and more from them, and it's not always a happy marriage between these groups. I mean, I can tell you a story about Slovakia that's very similar. And I also think it speaks to the issue that I said that being in bed with power actually can destroy in the long run, because it's visible in Poland. We know from Anna Grzymalowski's work that you should not do it. So I'm absolutely happy to see that the relationship is contested. I think it's very often the case that these advocacy groups push, and the parties do not do what they want. They have a complex relationship. However, the impact is there. It's sort of muddled, but I think you see this, with Hungary, I think it's a different story now. But in contested environments, you see this is a very uneasy relationship, but the one that exists, and it's very effective. And with the reason why I talked about the Senate bill, it is not as important as abortion ban in Poland. This is exactly why it's another example when the parties elected to move forward progressive rights do nothing, and they're going to be heavily punished for it. So again, that's also a story that I think resonates across the region quite a bit.
Thank you. When I call on you, if you don't mind just introducing yourself, that would be great, because it helps us all to know who's asking the question, where you're coming from, and so forth. Yeah, please.
Sure. Yes, so
Alberto Lopez. I'm fellow here in the Center for European Studies, and otherwise assistant professor in the Free University of Amsterdam. So first, thank you very much for your talk, and it is a very impressive project. So I have a question regarding the areas of contestation. So I think you make a very convincing argument around how there's issues in which there's leeway for progress, and you can even hold a majority in the countries you're studying in favor of abortion or certain rights for gay and lesbian people. But the moment you kind of enter in the field of children, and also you touch upon the institution of traditional family, then things get harder to advance in terms of policy advancement. And this advocacy groups and they know this, right? Like this is why they instrumentalize children and instrumentalize a family or the concept of family. I mean, and we know this, not only like in the case of these four countries you're talking about. I mean, this is the case in the U.S., right, or in other parts of Europe where children are instrumentalized, and their rights and their education is or basically like diverse education is kind of like under attack with the using children rights to have like an education that is pure as a kind of like an excuse. So I'd like to know, and this is like I would like to know more about how do you see this interaction between children's and family, and how it is can it be separated from the other things, from the other types of rights? Because at the end of the day, it's like these groups are very good at linking children and family to or their conception of family to other gender and LGBTQ rights. And then I would have like a second question on where I would like to know your opinion on visibility. Because like from the last part of your presentation, I could kind of like learn that one of the things you see as a promising avenue to progressive groups or progressive policies would be to try to depolarize and try to not over politicize gender and sexual advancements or policies. But we also know that visibility is sometimes important for these groups to get like social acceptance, and also to get the majority with them, also from the elite perspective. So I wish to know like how do you see like this kind of tension between the need for visibility to convince both the elite and the people, but also like the potential for these groups to use the visibility to kind of like revert rights and kind of like polarize around these issues and instrumentalize them for a conservative agenda. Thank you very much again, Professor Bustikov. I really liked your presentation.
Thank you. So there are a lot of things. Let me just share one personal anecdote. When I moved to the United States, I think the biggest, aside from not being able to open a mailbox, which I figured out, because you open it very differently. So that was difficult. And then the doorknobs. And then I couldn't understand how is it possible that gay and lesbian couples in the United States can adopt children. I just never thought about it before. I thought like, they can do that? You can do that? I didn't know. And I went through Soros University before, so I was indoctrinated. So, but in all seriousness, I think very often, I agree with you, very often when you see the end game and these groups that really weaponize these issues, they don't care about children and women. When you see the end game of the instrumentalization, I think there is a lot of hypocrisy. But I'm also trying to understand how is it possible that this resonates so deeply and that there is this massive platform that allows you to weaponize family for political purposes. And so there has to be something about family that we really have to take very seriously. I didn't talk about the demographic bust in Eastern Europe. I actually should have. Eastern Europe is one of the fastest shrinking demographic regions on the planet. So there are no children. So I think that's one source of anxiety. I also would like to emphasize that even if these countries had comprehensive welfare states under communism, and there are some welfare states, it's butchered now, the family has always been a fundamental shield against hardship. So even if you have access to healthcare, you still, when someone is in the hospital, still someone has to go there, bring a toilet paper, check on the nurses, and that goes to many aspects of life. So I think a lot of this, and actually we had the same conversation about this in Oxford, I think a lot of this really is a genuine fear of hardship and being left alone and not being protected in an era that's so brutal and competitive, and when everything is being outsourced. So when you read Orban's speech in 2014 about illiberalism, the whole speech is about bonds of solidarity. Like, do I believe that Orban has any bonds of, other than his, no. But I think it resonates very deeply with people. It resonates with anxieties. It is also, I think, where progressives are losing is that family infuses you with meaning. There are very few things that infuse you with meaning these days. And sort of these, these structures can do that. And so you as a progressive group, you are at a disadvantage because you're competing with a very thick, meaningful set of core values that have been around for, So I think, I really think, so I think we should take these anxieties seriously. Yes, there is a lot of hypocrisy. They do a fantastic job in weaponizing it. I think for progressives to move forward is to, take the initial anxiety very seriously, understand that, understanding sort of the emotional aspect of it. I mean, we live in the politics of emotion, but also I think the way to deal with this is through, really being compassionate about some of these things, just to find, to sort of remove it from politics, to really call upon human compassion in these areas, which I think is doable, but it's just becoming more and more difficult. Especially, I mean, I want to study parental groups. I think that's the battlefield these days.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yes, sir.
Okay, hello, I'm Leonard Sherman. I'm a visiting researcher here at the Center for European Studies, and usually I work in Berlin at the Berlin Social Science Center. Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I've got two questions. The first is there a coordination between these groups in the different countries, and connected to that, is there a transnational organization or coordination, and how are these groups then again connected to ultra-conservative organizations in other countries? And the second question is, I'm studying progressive protest and mobilization myself, and I was wondering, is there any visible counter-mobilization against these groups? So is it known within the public that these groups kind of exist and what they do, and are there, is the counter-mobilization against them?
So there is fantastic coordination. There must be a Dropbox that all have access to. So for example, when we read some of the emails that are written to Czech senators, like sometimes the Czech language was a little bit off. So I'm convinced that this was given to them and translated. Ordo Iuris has been, they're part of transnational groups. Some of the funding comes from evangelical circles from the United States. There is a very strong evidence some of the funding comes from Russia. They coordinate, they love each other, they support each other, and they are very, very good at this. And I think partly the reason why they're good at this is that fundamentally, sometimes when you think about the regulation in Texas, you think like someone must have just transported this to Eastern Europe. It's just so similar. And a lot of these policies are, and again, this is a universal set of issues. You talk about abortion, children, that's everywhere. So in a way, the diffusion is very fast and very easy. Like there is a technology to this that's very good and very well thought of. So for example, if you study, let's say, mobilization for ethnic rights, it gets very messy. But with stuff like that, because sexuality is so universal, it's quick. And of course, there is a counter-mobilization in Poland. Definitely, you see black protests. You see it in all the other countries. There is actually a mobilization, let's say, on behalf of Polish women in some of these countries. So there is a lot of solidarity. So it leads to back and forth. But I don't, and I know like a lot about advocacy for LGBTQ rights in the Czech Republic, and they are smart about this, but I cannot think of similar networks organized this way on the progressive side. Like I don't know. It's just like they just don't create these machineries. I don't know. Well, I don't think they do. I think this is really a technological invention of the right-wing conservative advocacy groups.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very insightful and unfortunately much too relevant today. I'm Dara Jankowskaite. I'm a grad student at the Davis Center. And my question is, when were the surveys conducted and the study at large? Because I do think for the Visegrad countries, ethnical contestation is not as relevant. There is just less immigrants compared to the rest of Europe. But if this is after full-scale invasion against Ukraine, then for instance for Czech Republic, there's more than 1 million foreigners now, so around 10%. For Poland, I think around 7.5. So I wonder whether with time those numbers have increased, if there is anything on the ethnical contestation increasing as well.
Yeah, so it was conducted around 2022. We have a question there about Ukrainian refugee as a neighbor, and in some of the surveys it picks up stuff, but it's quite unstable. But I have to deal with it again. So actually in some of the surveys, this sort of not being comfortable with a Ukrainian refugee as a neighbor, I think there might be some purchase to it, but I, again, because I'm not convinced with the results, I have so much to body. I would say, but for the ethnic contestation, so immigration, and again, I have to say this very carefully, immigration is not contested in Eastern Europe. What's contested is the idea of immigration. And I'm happy to elaborate, but rather not. But I think the ethnic contestation, it goes two ways. So sometimes the ethnic contestation creates very interesting synergies with this contestation around LGBTQ rights. So my favorite example is in Estonia, where the Russians hate gays and they vote for the Estonian far right because they vote on gay and lesbian issues. You see what happened in Hungary, which I studied so much, and the Hungarians were supposed to hate, the illiberals. However, they are now aligned with the current ruling coalition, and a lot of the issues, very often you see actually that some of the ethnic minorities ally on some of these socially conservative issues. Sometimes you see that it goes in parallel. So I think there's actually an enormously productive area of research to see whether the ethnic issues keep getting ethnic, or whether the ethnopopulism literature thinks it's one big kitchen sink, which actually empirically it's not, or whether they go sort of different ways. And you see all sorts of examples. I think the refugee issue, we have sort of, this was a survey we did, also endorsement experiments on militia groups in the same survey, and my husband is sort of spearheading that, and there we see that the Ukrainian issue is very important, but we don't think it's about Ukrainians. We think it's it's an anti-establishment opposition to governmental parties. So we have, for the far-right militia groups, we see an effect here. Here, I think it's not as strong. I feel I can happily neglect ethnicity when I talk about this, until someone asks.
Dan?
Yeah,
Oh,
thank you.
sorry.
Yeah, Troy Vermont. Two questions, a bit following up on what people have asked about already. One, actually, what is it that these groups how do these groups help political parties? This
Okay.
question of the relationship, what are they delivering? What are they helping mobilize voters? Are they
Yep.
providing intellectual infrastructure? What is it exactly so how do they gain leverage over parties? And it sounds like you were implying in your answer to the question here that they do. So that's one question. The second question, this goes back to the sort of comments at the end and the bigger picture perspectives of why this is even happening. I mean, if you kind of zoom out, in a way, because you're looking at these four cases, I'm trying to think of other regions, Western Europe, the United States. In some ways it sounds so similar to the United States that it's very, as a comparative, as you sort of wonder, what is the common situation that gives rise to this similar outcome out of such totally different contexts? And it seemed like you implied something about, and especially at the end, the kind of weakness of civil society in a way. I mean, it seemed like you offered two different hypotheses. I was wondering if you could sort of, what you think. One would be the weakness of alternative forms of organization, and that these are just the organizations that are around. It kind of reminds me of Dita Scotchwell describing towns where she does field research, where she goes to towns. The only thing that is around is churches. Those are the only civil society institutions. And so it's really not surprising that this is where people get organized and so on. So that would be one explanation, but it also sounded like you were saying there's something, you didn't put it in quite political economy terms, but the marketization, the kind of ruthless forces of extreme marketization leaves people feeling very vulnerable, and only family is the only thing they can rely on. So there's almost, I mean, I don't know, maybe those are two similar explanations, but they almost sound like two different explanations, and I was just wondering if you could reflect on that.
Yeah, let me just start with the sort of easier one. What do they do? So I think they're, the Dropbox, so prayer breakfast is a huge innovation. Some of these groups organize prayer breakfast in parliament. That has never happened before, and we know where that comes from. The legal advocacy, that is just absolutely, you look at some of the web pages are very good. So there is a language, there are strategies. So you look at the advocacy memos. So they write out the regulatory framework. They in a way advise how to write it, and they actually do write it. They physically have people who type it on their computers or they copy it. Another way they do it, I think in the Polish cases and in other cases. But this gets tricky, and I'm building mostly on Marcin Sztucerski's work, is that sometimes they mobilize together, but sometimes on Sundays they will make a little get together. But what Marcin was telling me, that the Polish Catholic Church is very careful about it, because they like mobilization for traditional family, but they don't always want to be seen in cahoots with these groups. So there are synergies there, but it's a very delicate relationship, similarly with political parties. And then, of course, there are prominent, very often this is leadership, there are prominent political leaders who, absolutely believe in this and who, openly work with these groups. So Záborská in the Slovak parliament, when there are bills about supporting NGOs, she makes sure that the organizations get the money, then the organizations, kick back in, political advocacy for groups. So I think, it's a big menu. I haven't thought about it systematically. I think it would be a good thing to think, mobilization from below to writing legal memos, to think about the spectrum that they do. And again, it varies country by country, and there is an element of love and hate with these political groups. In some cases, I think the parties really are driven to positions that because they look at the public opinion, they know they don't want to go there, but the pressure. It's very difficult to study money. I don't know if they give money. So with CPAC, but CPAC and Center for Fundamental Rights, of course, there is a money flow. There are estimates by investigative journalists how much sort of the state, so they do it through intermediaries. They don't give money to the center. They will give it to this group that gives it to this group, and oops, it goes to the center. So there are also monetary transfers, but I think that's probably mostly in Hungary, because I think these countries still have some institutions that monitor public procurement. So in terms of hypotheses, I think, I'm in the middle of this project, and I think there is a lot to be said about marketization, because I think fundamentally, if you remove the commitment of the mother from the family, things become very, very expensive. So, or things fall apart. So you don't get the labor, you don't get the emotional support. A lot of the solidarity is done through the mothers and through the women, also with respect to sort of a broader family. So I think that, and I sort of know these countries, a lot of the informal provision is still important. And it's not like a something cute thing, it's sometimes really is a matter of survival, I think. But I also think that there is an organization story which, this is so difficult to study. Let's say the Polish case is very well studied, and yet it's in a way, it's tough to find out how many organizations how many members do you have. You can see how many Facebook followers you do. Are you with this church or are you independent? So I would love to figure a way to study this. It's very hard, sort of to see what's the infrastructure and what is that the infrastructure delivers. But there is an infrastructure, and they work on it. And I think you will have a talk on social media. Some of it is through social media, but I think some of this is really parental groups talking to each other and then going to the street and signing petitions.
Okay, I have 3 more questions on the list.
Three.
Okay, you all right?
Yeah.
Please.
Yes, thank you, Lenka, for a very stimulating talk on a great project. Tim Landers, I'm a visiting scholar here, based in Oxford most of the time. I had two questions. One picks up on something that you mentioned in the Q&A, but you hadn't really mentioned, I think, in the talk, which I found very, very interesting, and I wanted to kind of push you to say more on this, which is the family as one of the 3 institutions of security, right? So you have market-based, family-based, and welfare state-based family forms of welfare, and coming at it from a social policy literature, this is something that we talk about. But it struck me that therefore, I wondered how you could start to unpick in your analytical approach the elements of support towards the family that are due to this latent support for a form of welfare security, as opposed to a kind of more, strictly speaking, anti-LGBT or pro-traditional family kind of cultural, kind of driver, right? And I think obviously you have different questions, you have different kind of survey questions here, but I wondered whether there's a way to prime respondents to kind of like pick that out a little bit more, because it strikes me that one, it would be very interesting just in and of itself, but also I suspect that different electoral groups or different partisan groups are going to be located very, very differently on these kind of 2 latent drivers of traditional family support, right? Second question was more about something that's sort of beyond the project. So it's a bit of an unfair question. It's something that I've been struggling with, which is why far-right parties and far-right movements in some countries start to mobilize much more on gendered-based challenges or grievances, as opposed to others, right? And so, there's the kind of like rise of Vox in Spain that kind of came a little bit out of nowhere, and also was very strictly on the kind of gender dimension rather than ethnic dimension. You have countries where the far right is kind of sort of like really hitting hard on both, and you have some countries where the kind of gendered element is completely evacuated. You have prominent gay far right politicians, even in the Front National, in at some points, at least in the last few years. And so they really locate themselves very differently on this kind of strategic 2-dimensional space of gender and ethnic mobilization. I wondered whether you have some thoughts as to why that might be. So it's a little bit outside the project. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I know a year and a half ago we talked about this already a little bit. If I had unlimited money and I had to do another survey, I think I would ask people about a lot of these welfare provisions and healthcare systems. Have dual structures when some part is privatized and some part is public. If you go and in some of these countries, the public, let's say, healthcare system is absolutely collapsing in many aspects, and actually it is a system in which if you don't have money for the private pillar, you will, even if you have access to it, you need a lot of family support. You also have to figure out how to get to the right doctor and all that. So I would probably analytically ask questions about access to private versus public healthcare and ability of people to purchase this, because I obviously if you have enough money, you don't have to rely on someone bringing you toilet paper. This is out of question. Then there is an issue, of course, of getting old, and I think in all these countries most people don't have the ability of private care, and these are aging populations, so it's very expensive, you have to be very wealthy to be able to afford it. So I think in some way maybe questions about anticipatory costs or the ability to protect yourself when you're aging. So I think health, maybe having kids, you can muddle through with that. But I think these are the 2 points when the families, when they're absolutely needed. You just cannot, you cannot be old without a family in Eastern Europe, or you can, but it's horrible. And maybe in other countries too. With the far right, I want to say one thing. I think in a lot of these countries, the appetite for the gendered mobilization doesn't come from the far right, because the far right traditional has been in the domain of ethnicity. So that's like in a way their niche and their playground. And then it's quite fun to see how they incorporate this or not. I think a lot of the contestation comes, the polarization and the amplification comes from parties that have traditionally been catch-all parties. They have the ability to absorb this issue, and they over time they move to the right. When you think about when you think about Smer in Slovakia, Smer initially was a moderate social democratic party, pretty normal. Law and Justice Party, I don't know if it was ever normal, but it moved, certainly. Orban, you see a sort of movement. I mean, these were catch-all driving parties. And I think also what I see in the Czech case, these guys, they should serve progressive voters, but there are they're culture warriors, and they are not in the far right in the Czech Republic. They are in the Civic Democratic Platform, which is the mainstream right, and then they're in the Christian Democratic Party. And the same in Slovakia. You see a lot of this comes from the radicalization of the Christian Democratic Party. So, then there is a blending of the far right, and the far right picks it up. But I think in a lot of these countries, it's really the radicalization where you start using these instrumentalize it, and you realize this is a fantastic way to polarize your electorate. So I think, if I were to think about strategically, I would think about what is it that the mainstream right is doing, and whether they fell for the temptation or not, and why not. And maybe this might be just an East European story, but I think but this is done by mainstream, or that this was started by the mainstream. This was not started from the edges, in my view. Yeah.
Please.
Yes, thanks a lot for your fascinating talk. My name is Timo Ava. I'm a visiting researcher here. I'm a historian studying the ethnic minorities and minority rights in Estonia in the first half of the 20th century. And I would be curious to hear a bit more about the broader societal, political conditions under which these groups and advocacy groups can survive and be, in a way, on the agenda more broadly in news and so on. And I would bring the example of Estonia here because, let's say, around 10 years ago when the same-sex civil partnership was discussed, and one small, actually, Catholic, ultra-conservative group which had ties with these circles in Poland, these Ordo Iuris and so on, they became one of the main opponents in bringing this topic continuously to the agenda, and managed to actually hijack, in a way, the public discussion sphere and triggering the fears of, the collapse of traditional society and the traditional family and so on. So eventually, civil partnership law was passed, and then a couple of years ago, a full same-sex marriage law was introduced. And after that, basically, the topic is not in the news at all anymore, and they don't manage to win any public presence anymore. So perhaps you have any observances, ideas in this regard. Do we have any hope?
More about Estonia than I do. I'm excited about Russians voting with nationalists. I would say maybe you have a bigger problem next door. So sometimes that helps. And I mean, sorry to be this crude, but sometimes having a mortal threat next to you suppresses some things. But I actually, I think I should look into this, the conditions under which this can be diffused. So one crude answer would be bigger issues. Another thing is that when you think of it this is very often framed as fight with the West. I always thought that the Baltics have to be, that the foreign policy and then this enormous threat in the Baltics have to be taken very seriously into consideration. Because in a way, if you frame this as Western values, and then and you have this, you know, you have Russia next door, then you better think whether you really want to polarize this as an anti-EU, anti-thing, you know. So so that would be like my really, you know, bottom feeder explanation, because I don't know that much about it. But you know, maybe there is hope. I mean, Estonia is highly secular. I think Czech Republic, the marriage between men, the same-sex marriage actually almost passed. But like, thank you, Democratic Coalition, for yet again not delivering on your electoral promises. But I think it's a country that's almost there. And actually, I know from the advocacy groups, they have one of the strategies of the LGBTQ advocates in the Czech Republic was to work through kids. So they basically say, look, a lot of the LGBT couples already have kids from previous marriages. And so do you really, you know, and the argument for compassion, do you really want to deprive, let's say, 2 lesbian women of equal rights when actually one of them is a biological mother already, you know, it's through. And then the bigger context, I don't know how much time we have. I think it's, you know, coming from Florida, it's obvious that liberalism in its many forms is dead, and it has delivered, I think, fantastic.
Everybody's looking at you.
Yeah, we didn't.
We're in Massachusetts. This is
Yeah.
news to us.
I don't know, maybe it's still alive here, but it's definitely dead in many places. But I think it's dead as an intellectual project, and unless there is a compelling project that can infuse people with enthusiasm, it's going to be very difficult to reverse this machinery. And sort of the final, so I think it's a lack of imagination and sort of a just, you know, ideas. You know, the right has all the great ideas that excite people at this moment. Like, it's not what excites me, but it does excite a lot of people. So, and they are winning, and they are, I mean, they're partly winning because they can infuse people with enthusiasm about things they care deeply about, but also, and going back to your original question, they understand money and they understand influence, and they are playing this game very dirty. So they understand that the state can be turned into a milk cow for all these projects, and that's why all these NGOs are getting state support. That's why there's this machinery, that's why there is this fusion of these NGOs with parties and state. So I think in terms of technology of power and technological ability to entrench yourself, they just move fast, they help each other, and they believe in it.
Okay, one more question. Repeat offender, please. Go ahead.
I mean, if there's other people who want to ask a question.
You're the last.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I just wanted to, well, first on the money question, I mean, there's this research by Chris Velasco on how, you know, like even the you know, so he basically researches like conservative groups in the US and how like they send money to the places to fund socially conservative place, and basically what they do here to make like the flow of money basically impossible to follow is they constitute as churches, and as such they're basically like their finances are basically completely opaque and they make it very difficult to see how these flows kind of go. And yeah, and I also wanted to react to Tim and your comment on, I mean, also in Spain, he mentioned Vox, but even in Spain, these groups are generally like closer to center-right or even sometimes center-left parties. I'm sure, I mean, Lenka, you know, it's like Citizens Go, and that's basically like a group that has been, you know, traditionally very close to PP rather than to Vox. So yeah, I feel like this is something interesting. At the end of the day, like these groups like to be like close to parties that have the money as well, right? Like, and the parties that are part of the establishment. So when they have to choose between far right niche parties or, you know, even non-government parties and government parties, they usually know where to go. But then this brings me to the, you know, my last question, which is on heteronationalism. You actually mentioned it in the last comment, because we were talking about the ethno-national dimension that is not so present in some in the countries you've been studying. But I mean, kind of like the type of ethno-national contestation that they kind of like bring into the table is kind of like this idea of there's like some countries kind of like trying to impose values. It will be the European Union in the case of Poland or Hungary sometimes, but also Slovakia. So I like my question, I guess, is kind of like maybe like it is not channeled through immigration, like this kind of like nativist argumentation in these countries, but it comes from the idea of we don't want to have like the incursion of other countries in our values, like Putin does, and how Philip Ayub or Christina Stockel have shown for certain countries. I wanted to know like how do you see this phenomenon going in these contexts, and whether these organizations use this nationalism as a platform to promote their traditional family values. Thank you.
Yeah, so there is some fusion. So when I sort of mentioned that the term ethnopopulism, ethno-nationalism, I think all I want to advocate for is not to say that, let's say, national identity or national pride is not invoked and instrumentalized and sort of tied to some of these issues. Of course it is, but I think it's really important to disaggregate issues that deal with that are related to migration, ethnicity, LGBTQ, because they don't always go hand in hand. So, and I think there is a lot of variation across these countries, and there are also a lot of changes over time when you see that parties sort of shift their appeals. And so I think, not that the fusion doesn't exist, but I think if you want to understand, let's say, party competition and why some of these groups, I think I really like the idea you go for the big players where the money is instead of niche players that just contest, just nationalism. I think if you want to understand party contestation, you have to disaggregate ethnic appeals from appeals about LGBTQ, because sometimes it's not used, or it maybe it was more salient 5 years ago, and the immigration is just not as salient as it used to be. So these things go up and down. So all I'm saying is, think about it as in different baskets, see when it comes together, but very often it actually does not come together, and I think we have to be very sensitive to it.
Okay, thank you very, very much. This was a wonderful set of questions and a terrific talk. Thanks for coming.